So it's been a couple years since my last horror movie series review. I'm trying to get more of these done, but they take quite a long time to make, so please be patient and hopefully we can get some bigger ones early next year. I'm still working on those MCU videos as well as the Hella Mega review videos, but in the meantime I thought it would be a good idea to take a look at a trilogy that I remember getting multiple requests for back in the day when I just used to review anything that people requested, that being the From Dusk Till Dawn trilogy. Created by Robert Rodriguez, Quentin Tarantino and Robert Kurtzman, starting as a little cult action horror movie, the franchise somehow grew pretty big in the early 2000s. There were 2 straight-to-video sequels, a video game which looks somewhat okay, and most recently a TV show a couple years ago. I haven't seen the TV show, but I have seen the trilogy, so for now we'll talk about that and maybe discuss the TV show some point in the future. Let's start with the original movie, From Dusk Till Dawn from 1996. The idea for the film was conceived by Robert Kurtzman, who hired Quentin Tarantino to write the movie. It was the first screenplay that Tarantino would be hired to write, and in return, Kurtzman would do the FX for Reservoir Dogs. After the success of Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction, the film was officially greenlit, and Robert Rodriguez, seeing success from his first 2 movies, El Mariachi and Desperado, joined on as the director. The film starts off really strong with an opening scene which is not only my favourite part of the movie, but one of my favourite opening scenes in any movie. We see a clerk and ranger in a liquor store talking, however it turns out the 2 fugitives, Seth and Richie Gecko, played by George Clooney and Tarantino, are actually holding 2 women at gunpoint and forcing the clerk to remain calm until the ranger leaves. Richie loses it and shoots the ranger, believing that the clerk is signalling him. This leads to a shootout which ends with them burning down the liquor store and driving away. This scene for me perfectly encapsulates what makes the first half of the movie so entertaining. You see the dynamic between the 2 brothers, the cinematography and tension presented, it's all incredibly exciting. The scene is really hilarious and super tense, it's exactly what you expect from Tarantino. It even has character actor Michael Parks playing the ranger Earl McGraw, a character which he would reprise in Kill Bill and Death Proof. The Gecko brothers are on the run following a bank robbery which led them to taking a bank clerk hostage. They have to escape over the Mexican border to meet a man who will take them to El Rey, a safe place for fugitives looking to escape the feds. After Richie rapes and murders the clerk that they've taken hostage, Seth takes hostage a family who are on vacation in an RV. The dad, Jacob, played by Harvey Keitel, is a pastor who is experiencing a crisis in his faith following the death of his wife, something that only really comes into play later on, and even then it's never really resolved. The brothers force the family to take them to Mexico and stay with them at a bar called the Titty Twister, where they are due to meet their contact at dawn. After having a few drinks and Tarantino having the time of his life getting to lick Salma Hayek's feet, which is the grossest bit in the whole film, it's revealed that the bar is filled with vampires. So the rest of the film is about the few people who survived being attacked by them, trying to survive as more and more of them arrive to kill them. The film can easily be split into 2 halves. The first half is a Tarantino classic crime movie, and the second half is a violent action horror with excessive gore and incredibly cheesy moments. Although I do like both halves of the movie, my biggest problem with the film is just how they're stitched together so haphazardly. It's like trying to stitch half of a dog to half of a cat. If you had a full dog or a full cat, then you'd have something great, but by stitching half of each together and doing it really badly, you get something which just doesn't really work. And that's not to say that this is a bad movie, it's a very entertaining movie, but the way they merge the 2 together creates something that feels super inconsistent. I've personally always preferred the first half, but I think that comes down to the fact that I'm kind of a sucker for that classic Tarantino dialogue. The characters are very representative of the sort of characters that Tarantino is great at writing. These characters who in a lot of ways are kind of evil and do horrible stuff, but deep down have some sort of moral code, at least for the most part. And what makes it better is that there are some decent performances in there from George Clooney, Harvey Keitel and Juliette Lewis, especially George Clooney, who plays a character who is somehow unlikable but also incredibly charming at the same time. Of course, Quentin Tarantino still is a really terrible actor, but To be fair, this is probably, I'd say, his best acting performance, but considering just how bad he is in everything else, there's not really a lot of competition. Even then, he's still not good in this movie. There are multiple hilarious lines in the early part of the movie which make me laugh every single time.
Where are you taking us?
Mexico.
What's in Mexico?
Mexicans.
The second half, however, isn't without its strengths. There are still some great lines here, and the effect work is great, but there's also a lot of stuff I really don't like. There's a lot of exposition and character backgrounds here, which not only bring the action to a screeching halt, but they also go on for so long and don't have any impact on the characters or the story of the film. There's a character who has a long monologue about how he fought in Nam, but then he's killed almost straight afterwards, making those 3 or 4 minutes completely pointless. The action in this part of the film is suitably cheesy and ridiculous in a way that feels very fitting of its tone and is actually pretty fun to watch. Robert Rodriguez clearly knows that this film is practically a B-movie with a lot of ham in it, and he plays up to this really well. The usage of practical effects are all great, and there are some great creature effects that look fantastic. I love the way they put a spin on the classic rules of vampires and recontextualize them into a much more modern feel. It's something that Fright Night and The Lost Boys did really well in the 80s, and something that was done just really well here in the 90s. But there are a lot of conveniences and cliched tropes in this half that really take you out the film. If you're accepting the fact that this part of the film is pretty ridiculous and cheesy, you'll probably have a lot more fun, but the problem is it's the complete opposite of what the first half was. Although there's humor in the first half, you still take it very seriously because that's what the film wants you to do. So when they completely pull the rug out and give you this campy, cheesy action stuff, it feels really unnatural and forced. It doesn't really work when they're expecting you to take half the film super seriously and then the other half not seriously at all. It just makes something that's super inconsistent tonally, and yeah, that's just the biggest problem with this movie. It's 2 halves of something completely different that don't work well together and switch incredibly suddenly. It probably wouldn't be quite as bad if it was like a gradual transition, but it's literally just one switch in one scene, and it doesn't work. If there's one good thing I'll say about this movie, is that upon a second or third viewing when you know the switch is going to happen, it's definitely a lot more entertaining to watch, but it doesn't hide this huge flaw. Overall, From Dusk Till Dawn is an incredibly entertaining, funny and well-made movie. It's just a shame that the 2 halves are so incredibly different from each other, and it causes the film to feel super inconsistent. I'm going to give it 3.5 stars out of 5. Throughout the 90s, direct-to-video sequels seemed to be the way basically every single horror sequel was released. It meant you could make a movie on a much smaller budget and get a large return because people would be more accepting of cheaper effects because it's a straight-to-video movie. What do you expect? Although Dimension Films had done it a couple times before, one of their first big direct-to-video releases was From Dusk Till Dawn 2: Texas Blood Money. The film was co-written and directed by Scott Spiegel, one of the writers of Evil Dead 2, and the guy who first introduced Tarantino to producer Lawrence Bender, leading to Reservoir Dogs being made. But he also directed Hostel 3, so I kind of hate him and had very low expectations for this film. It starts with a scene of Bruce Campbell and some woman getting attacked by bats in an elevator, which is pretty ridiculous. It does turn out it's something that one of the characters is watching on TV, which is a shame because it's like the silliest and probably most entertaining moment of the film, and also such a waste of Bruce Campbell to be in this one short 2-minute scene. After escaping from prison, a bank robber called Luther contacts his old friend Buck, played by Robert Patrick, aka the T-1000 from Terminator 2, to help get their old gang back together. The team consists of them two, CW, Ray Bob, and Jesus, played by Raymond Cruz, who also plays Tuco in Breaking Bad. The group wait at a motel motel for Luther, who, while on his way, hits a bat, causing his car to break down. He walks to the Titty Twister, which is nearby, and asks Danny Trejo for help, which leads to him being attacked and turned into a vampire. Back at the motel, the group for some reason watch porn together for about 15-20 minutes. I'm not even kidding, that's a thing they do. But Jesus gets super frustrated and leaves to bang a random woman. Luther then attacks them both, leading Jesus to also be turned into a vampire. They then go to rob a bank, which leads to them all being turned into a vampire one by one, apart from Buck. They've also been followed by the police, which leads to this large standoff between the vampires and the police. It is about as dumb as it sounds. Unlike the first movie, the film is pretty consistent in terms of tone and genre. There are definitely elements of a western in there, but this is just a straight up action horror movie, and a pretty terrible one at that. Despite the tonal issues I had with the first movie, at least for the most part the script was well written, the characters were fun to watch, and the action was really well directed. But this film has literally none of that. The script is laughably bad in points.
Hell, fucko.
The characters might as well not be there because they have no personality whatsoever, and the action is just the same repeating thing for like 45 minutes. The final standoff felt never ending because it's just the same thing happening over and over again. But it's made a lot funnier by the fact that a solar eclipse happens to happen just as it turns daylight, and by that I mean the moon quickly moves in front of the sun, stays there for 20 minutes, and then quickly moves out of the way again. It's pretty hilariously dumb. It just felt like they were trying really hard to drag this section out because they realized just how little they actually had. It's such a dull and shallow film watching experience, although there are some unintentionally hilarious moments, mostly caused by the weirdly homoerotic undertone. This film, for the most part, is just pointless. The special effect work is pretty terrible and trades a lot of the practical effect work for really bad CGI. I mean, like early episodes of Buffy the Vampire level of CGI, where it's obvious that they had a very low budget so they couldn't get anything somewhat decent at all. But even then, a lot of the time there's just no effects at all. The first movie took these vampires and turned them into horrific creatures with great practical costumes, but here they're pretty much just normal people with fangs. It's so uninteresting. If there's one good thing I will say for the movie, it's that it contains some surprisingly creative cinematography. The film is actually really well shot, has some great framing and really interesting camera choices for the most part. There's a part where the camera goes up and down while someone does push-ups that I really like. There's also a scene where the camera's attached to a fan and it goes around the room, which I also like, even if It Follows did it much better. There was also a scene where they're breaking into a safe and the camera's attached onto the safe, so as he's twisting it around, the camera goes around. Stuff like that I really enjoyed. There's even a split diopter shot, which if you want to learn more about, I did a video essay about it on my other channel called The Movie Textbook. But apart from that, this film has basically nothing. I would not recommend it at all. So I'm going to give From Dusk Till Dawn 2 Texas Blood Money a 1 out of 5. This brings us to the final movie in the trilogy, From Dusk Till Dawn 3, The Hangman's Daughter, which premiered at a film festival just 7 months after the second movie was released. They had a really quick turnaround on these two films for some reason. The film was written by Alvaro Rodriguez, Robert Rodriguez's cousin, from a story that was co-written by the two. It was also directed by PJ Pesca, director of The Lost Boys: The Tribe, a sequel that I remember fairly enjoying back when I reviewed it a few years ago, but at the same time I literally remember nothing of the film. Unlike the second movie, this movie is actually a prequel set in 1913. Similar to the first movie that starts off as a crime film before turning into an action horror, this movie starts off as a western before turning into an action horror. The film starts off with Michael Parks, who now plays a completely different role, an American writer called Ambrose Bierce, a real-life writer who, after traveling around Mexico, randomly went missing and was never seen again. He decides that he's going to join a revolutionary army, which leads him to meeting John and Mary, a newly married couple who are traveling to Mexico to preach Christianity. At the same time, an outlaw called Johnny Madrid escapes from being hung with the help of Catherine Reese, a young woman who wants to become Madrid's apprentice as an outlaw. outlaw. Madrid then kidnaps the Hangman's daughter Esmeralda and escapes. Reese believes that Bierce holds an invaluable object, so Madrid's outlaw gang attack the stagecoach that Bierce, John and Mary are on. This leads to probably the best bit of the film, a surprisingly well-made chase/action scene which is actually quite a lot of fun. I mean, it's nothing special, I've seen things like this a million times before, but for what it is, it's decent. After it turns out that Bierce didn't have anything, Madrid hangs Reese and leaves her for dead. However, she somehow manages to hang and survive for like multiple hours before the Hangman frees her. I don't know how she managed to survive that, but somehow it happens. Everyone then just happens to coincidentally end up at a titty twister somehow, which in this film is an inn as well as a brothel. The vampires all reveal themselves, and it turns out that Esmeralda's grandmother is the head vampire and that they need to bite her to transform her into the vampire princess or something, and then there's a fight and shit, I guess. To be completely honest, the story to this film is so unnecessarily convoluted and complicated that I really don't know what to say. The film is really pretty terrible, but it's slightly better than the second movie. While the second movie was practically devoid of everything that made the first film enjoyable, at least this movie has some somewhat decent action and gore. For the most part, it's nothing great, but it's alright. The violence and practical effects in this movie are pretty well done and easily the best parts of the film, outside that western action sequence early on. But the film somehow manages to contain almost all of the same problems that each of the first two movies had independently from each other. The characters are just as flat and empty and uninteresting as the second movie, and it's also just as dull as that one. But by going heavy on the western element, the film definitely manages to set itself apart and do something a little bit more interesting than whatever the second film was. Not by much, but it's something. And then the film has that really big inconsistent problem with the first movie, where it just feels like two completely different movies that are crammed together. But the problem here is that neither of them are very good at all. The western part, although isn't the worst, is a pretty by the number westerns which follows every trope in the book and just repeatedly copies shots and moments from The Good, the Bad and the Ugly and some of the other films like that. And the other half is pretty mediocre at best. Although the action is decent enough and the practical effects are pretty good, the script is really what ruins this part of the film. The story is just so needlessly complicated and there's so much going on that it's really hard to focus on anything. There are way too many characters for a film of this length, and there's not enough screen time dedicated to developing them or even the story of the film for it to be anywhere near decent, leading to moments where a lot of things just don't make any sense. Of course, a film like fucking From Dusk Till Dawn 3 isn't the sort of film where you should be taking it overly seriously, and I think if it had just been a repeat of the first movie but set in the Wild West, it probably would have been a lot more enjoyable. But this needless backstory and lore that they try to expand upon on this movie just gets so confusing that it's impossible to completely shut your brain off and just enjoy it. The film all in all isn't the worst, but it's not good. I think I enjoyed it slightly more than the second just because of the couple bits in the western section that I really enjoyed and because there is much more practical effect usage, which is alright. Yeah, I wouldn't recommend it at all. I'm going to give this one 1.5 stars out of 5. Overall, the From Dusk Till Dawn trilogy isn't good. The first movie is pretty fun and entertaining, even despite its tonal inconsistencies, but the other two movies suck. I'm interested in checking out the TV show as the whole thing is on Netflix, so maybe I'll give it a watch sometime and do a separate review of that. I've heard very mixed things about it. People seem to think it's either really entertaining or really terrible, so I'm looking forward to seeing what I think. If you want to hear me talk more in depth about the trilogy, I talked about it on my podcast, The Sunday Movie Marathon, which I do with a couple of my friends every single week. Basically, we sit down and marathon 3 or 4, maybe more films, and then we talk about them afterwards. We watched the trilogy together, and that's where I watched them for the review. That episode's been up a couple weeks and there's a few more episodes out at the moment, so if you want to hear us talk more about it in just more of a casual way, then check out that podcast. It's available everywhere. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time.